What was the other thing I was going to say? Yeah. Uh-oh.
The location of the smoke detector in a room on a wall is somewhat ambiguous. They say in the online forums or whatever about 12 inches. Well, the actual rule is not just that they be between 4 inches and 12 inches from the ceiling, but that the top of the box has to be at least 4 inches from the ceiling, and the bottom of the box, the outlet box for the smoke detector, has to be less than 12 inches from the ceiling. So in other words, the 4 to 12 inches is a band, and the box has to be somewhere in between there. You can't have the top of the box, say, 12 inches below the ceiling, for example. Now, in our case, the outdoor outlet, which is out on the porch, was very, very close to an outlet on the inside in the kitchen, and I initially connected it up that way to be on the same circuit, but that's actually frowned upon. The kitchen circuits, where you have to have two for the appliances on the countertop, those are supposed to be dedicated just to kitchen appliances, and you shouldn't connect regular outlets or the outdoor outlet, for example, on that same circuit. The ceiling lights in a walk-in closet need to be planned out such that the light doesn't get too close to something that's combustible. And the way they state this is that you should plan on a 12-inch shelf being all the way around the perimeter of the room, and then allow another 12 inches from that shelf before you get to the light, whether it be a LED or fluorescent or whatever. So the whole idea is to avoid fires and having the heat of a light start your clothes on fire in the closet. So some careful planning is required there. Usually you can turn the fixture one way or the other and get extra clearance if the fixture is a long one. Some of the old wire that we found lying around didn't have markings, or if they ever did, they got worn off. You just can't read them. And for very thick wire, it's difficult to determine what gauge it is, whether it's 4 gauge, 2 gauge, and so on, when you get those big thick wires, because they will be bundled, say, as 7 aluminum wires, strands that make up one wire, and it's hard to know what it is if there's no markings on it. So the best policy is just discard that wire. It's one of those things you just can't reuse if you're not sure what it is. Dryer circuits and stove circuits used to have what's called 2-wire plus ground. This is where there were 2 hot wires, probably black and white, and then a ground wire, which is bare copper or else green wire. Nowadays, stoves and dryers have to have 2 hot wires plus a neutral wire. So it's a black, a red, and a white, plus the ground wire. And so if you've got these old 2-wire circuits for a stove or a dryer and you're upgrading, you really need to just pull those out. There's nothing you can do with that unless you want to run a whole nother single wire along that same path to make up the third wire. But it makes more sense just to rip it out and buy new, unfortunately. So this is another case where you have to throw some old wire away. On an electric panel, the main lugs are those connections. There'll be 3 of them altogether that where the power comes in from the meter outside, but from the power company into your house. Those are the main source of power for your house. So there's a big one for power on one side, that's the hot side, another one for hot on the other side, and then there'll be a third one which is neutral, which is white or marked with a white band on it. Now the problem is these are hooked into the panel with these great big lug nuts, probably about 3/4 of an inch square, that are screwing these down. And on older panels, these are not covered up. And the problem is that even if you have the main breaker turned off, there is still power on those 2 lug nuts that are for the main power coming into your house. So turning off the main circuit breaker doesn't help. They're still hot. So what you want to do is to get a couple of protectors, and these were very cheap. I found for like $2 or $3 online, and you get it for your particular panel. And what you have to do is have the power company turn off the power to your house, which is removing the meter, is how they'll turn off the power. Then you can put on these plastic protectors, and I even put a zip tie around each one to make sure they held on tightly. And then you could request that the power be turned back on. This will give you a little extra protection that if you're working in the box, that you won't accidentally touch those hot lug nuts. And we did find that the power company is very willing to disconnect your service temporarily. You just have to call them up and say, I'm working inside, I would like to have power for the whole house turned off. And they'll probably say, when do you want it and when do you want it turned back on? And they'll be more than happy to do this because it's a safety measure. And it's much better to avoid problems by turning off the power than to take a chance. And this feature is free. It doesn't cost anything for them to come out, turn it off and turn it on. Now, if you're rearranging the circuit breakers, as far as the location of the breaker for a particular circuit in the house, let's say you want the living room circuit breaker to be over here at number 15. And the kitchen circuit breakers 1 and 2 maybe 17 and 19, something like that. Well, if the old circuits were not set up that way, you do have to be on your toes a little bit. If you're like me, I tried and save wire, this circuit's already there, the circuit breaker's already there. And so I left that and then connected up all the living room circuits and all the kitchen circuits and so on. But if I was reusing one of those old circuits, there's a chance then I had to move the circuit breaker from wherever it used to be to my new position. And then the problem is that new position might be further away and require a longer wire to reach that particular spot in the panel. And so a couple times I forgot to think about this. I left the wire connected where it was. I connected all the outlets to the circuit and then tried to move the breaker to its new location, and the wire was too short. And so you have some difficult choices to make there. Do you have a messy looking panel, if you can even make it work, or you have to change where you have the circuit breaker, or you just make do. So this is one of the things that's easy to forget, but if you're reusing a circuit back at the panel, make sure that the wire is pulled through the panel long enough so that it can reach the new location for your breaker. In the electric panel, there are a lot of screws that are tightened down holding the different hot wires and ground wires and neutral wires. Sometimes those neutral wires or ground wire screws are torqued really tight and too tight. There is some specification for how tight they're supposed to be. I don't know what it is. I don't have a torque wrench to measure it. But I found some of these I just could not unscrew. It ended up just rounding off the head on the screw. I tried using either the square drive or a regular standard flat screwdriver. Both of those, the head just squished before the screw turned. So in those cases, the thing to do is just to reach in there. Of course, you've got the power off all the time for all these, but you reach in there with your wire cutters and just snip off the old wire as close as you can to that screw with the stripped head, and just clean it up and then just leave it. Don't try and reuse that particular screw, just go on to another one. Another thing that is a more modern problem is if you're using a mini split where you've got an outdoor condenser and then an indoor head unit, there's a control line that runs from the condenser to that head indoors. Now this control line is 120 volts. Some people think it's only 12 volts, a low voltage control line, but it's a full 120 volts. So you've got a 240 volt circuit going to the condenser, and then there's 120 coming back to the head. So that means it's a potential for shock and electrocution if you were to touch that line. And so there's a provision in the code that there has to be a way for the electrician to turn off the power securely within reach of where he's working on that indoor unit, indoor head. And this can be accomplished either with a switch on the wall next to it, which is really not the best option. And the option that we did go with was that you buy these what are called circuit breaker locks or lockouts, and they're just a little pass thing that fits over your circuit breaker switch that you can lock with a padlock and keep somebody from turning that breaker on when you're still working on it. So the idea is that those breaker locks are in the panel, and if the electrician comes, he'll put one of those locks on, he'll turn off the circuit breaker, put the lock on, and put his own padlock on with a key or a combination, and then go do his work. And that way he knows he's safe, that no one is going to turn on the power to the condenser, which would feed power back into the head unit. And then when he's done, he can then go back and take off his lock and take off the lockout and switch the power back on for the mini split condenser, which will in turn feed the head unit indoors.